Thank you everyone for coming, and thank you so much, Rune, for that great introduction. I'm really pleased to be here, both because of all of the familiar faces that I saw on the way in, and I taught here for, I guess, about 6 years. And it's been a couple of years since I've been away, so it's a pleasure to be back and see how great the 10th floor lab looks too. So as Rune said, I run a small studio in Brooklyn. It's just two of us, and I think it's been about 10 years that I've had my practice now, and like the first 3 or so it was just me, and since then it's been me and one other person. And I think in some ways our practice mirrors the experience of being a student in design school, just in the sense that there are not that many of us. For the most part, what you're doing here is your work, and you're getting feedback from instructors that you may or may not want to follow. But in other ways, I think our practice is very different, and I think what I want to focus on this in this talk is getting kind of outside of yourself. The influence of other people, other forces, things you might not expect, that really kind of often have a very pivotal role in the work that we do as designers, and I think as students, it may be kind of hard to see that because most of the time what you're doing is you're responsible for all of it, and at most you're maybe working with one other person. But in reality, there's this whole constellation of other people that are involved in most things that we do in our office, even though our office is only two of us. And most of our clients are, as Rune said, people in architecture and art, and I'd say about half of our work is books and other print projects, and the other half is websites and signage projects and exhibition graphics and things like that. So being a small studio, we're constantly interacting with all of the people who have these roles that you see up here, and many more as well. So I'm going to talk about 6 projects today that we've done, kind of through this lens of influence, the influence of other people or things outside of us. The first one is a book cover for Critique of Everyday Life by Henri Lefebvre. And we've had the pleasure over a period of maybe 5 or 6 years to design a number of covers for Verso books, and here's just a kind of selection of a number of them. We're often interested in I think in everything that we do, both finding interesting structural ideas that may be able to be expressed through materials or production techniques, but really using structure as an idea rather than just as a way to collect information together. We also tend to be quite focused on typography, and so you can see as well that a lot of these covers are very kind of type-driven. And Andy Pressman of Rumor's studio was the art director of Verso's catalog for many years, and only recently stepped away from it. But Andy was a real partner with in all of the covers that I've just shown you, and I think probably one of the sharpest and most incisive critics of design that I've ever met. So this is one of the first concepts that I showed to Andy for this cover, and this was actually also the first one-volume version of this book that had been published. The previous editions had been 3 separate volumes. So it had this like massive, 2.5 to 3 inch wide spine, and it just seemed like, we really need to do something with that surface just because it's so big. And so we started working on some ideas that involved like really kind of crossing over that spine, and for a while I was really kind of stuck on this idea of doing something with the barcode, putting it in an unusual place as some kind of probably not all that smart comment on capitalism. So first it was on the spine, and then on this version it was also on the spine, but kind of pushed everything, all the big type, off to the sides and put the blurb on the spine, along with the logo and genre and price. And then what Andy said when I sent these to him is, love the descriptive text on the spine, but don't care so much about the title breaking in this manner. Feels weaker than the first direction, or maybe more of a design gesture for its own sake. And he was right. So I, in the next iteration, decided to try to put the author name and the title still large, but kind of within the blurb that was sitting on the spine, so that they had a reason to be where they were. But again, that barcode, is kind of sneaking out onto the front cover. And then Andy said, well, we do need to get the Verso logo on the spine. And have you tried a version of the cover without the barcode? I say this partly because I'm not sure it needs it, and partly because Random House, the distributors, are probably not going to let it fly. But just curious how important you think it is. So again, there's not just Andy's influence, but the distributor's influence, who's not somebody that I'm ever even in contact when I'm doing these covers. So then this is the next iteration, where everything just kind of gets compressed onto the space of the spine, except for the bits of the title and the author name that creep out onto the back and front covers, and which is basically how the final product ended up looking. This photo is a little confusing, maybe, but that's 2 copies of the book, so you could sort of see all the surfaces in one image. Also, as a postscript, after the books arrived in the warehouse, Verso's production director said, I've seen critique in the UK office and it looks fantastic. Was particularly pleased to see that it had completely baffled Random House's warehouse staff too. They wrote to us to check that it wasn't a printing error. The Arab City is a book that we designed for Columbia Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation. It's a book about, as you might imagine, Arab architecture. And this was a case in which we started with the cover, which is something that pretty much no designer ever wants to do unless you're only designing the cover. Like in the case of the Verso books, most of those are just a cover and someone else does the interior. But we always want to save the cover until the end so that the interior of the book can find ways to express itself through the cover. But publishers and distributors always want the cover first so that they have something to put in their catalog, something to put on their website to promote the book and to help sales. So this was a cover that was done before anything else, and picks up on some ideas of Arab architectural ornamentation, kind of stacking and layering and type that's sort of on every other layer and kind of curving in and around these squares that comprise the cover, which is almost exactly how it ended up in the end. And so then once we decided to start looking at the interior, we took some of the elements from the cover and tried to pull them into the interior of the book. And we tried some things with a table of contents where we were stacking images on each other and section openers that used some of the same motifs. In the end, most of those things didn't end up remaining in the design of the book. But this is a spread from the interior, and the typography is pretty straightforward. And the images kind of sit in between columns of text. But the reason I'm showing this to you is not to show you the design of the inside, but instead to talk about that kind of fake shadow you see in the middle of the gutter. Sean Yendries, who's a designer that was working with me at the time and worked with me on this book, that shadow is an innovation or a tactic that he brought to the studio. That was never something that I did before, but have since started doing it just as a way to give the client an understanding of the book as a 3-dimensional object. So it's just this like gradient box in the middle on our master pages in InDesign. But one day as Sean was working on the layout, something odd happened just in the rendering of that shadow as he was scrolling through pages, and it just kind of rendered itself as a black bar, and then InDesign crashed. but he said, well, that's kind of nice. Maybe we should just do that. So in the end, every spread of the book has this stripe running down the gutter, which was not. I think I tend to be the kind of designer sometimes who I've made an effort over the years to break away from this, but who really wants to kind of have the whole thing figured out in my head before I even start working. But this was a great example of something that really never would have occurred to us unless we had been open enough to recognize an opportunity when it presented itself. And so it really has no conceptual justification or functional purpose, but it does kind of hold the page in a way that I think, because the type is rather, in many cases, quite light and somewhat delicate, this kind of graphic anchor in the middle of every spread really helps to kind of ground the layouts. And there are some other variations in number of columns and images, the way they work with text, and we used gold metallic ink for some of the sections. But in the end, I think one of the book's kind of most salient design features is something that was really just a software glitch. Another book that we designed for Columbia is a book called Architecture is All Over. This was a book of essays about both architecture's ubiquity and its inevitable imminent demise. And so this idea of the double entendre, or of two ways of seeing something, is something that really drove the compilation of the texts that comprised the book, but it was also something that we wanted to reflect in the design somehow. So the kind of two-faced Janus is something that was a figure that was haunting us throughout the design process. Ben Furman Lee, who's a designer who has worked with me for the last couple of years and who also teaches here at Parsons, is also a fantastic type designer, and so he started working on some typefaces for this book that kind of reference this idea of both past and future, and ubiquity and demise. So this one was based on kind of Roman capitals inscribed into columns, and then we started looking at some really forward-looking architectural publications from the 60s and 70s, things like Utopie and Archigrome, and then creating new typefaces based on some of the things that we were seeing in the type that was used in those publications. This was kind of a pair of typefaces that were meant in some ways to be used together, but the top one has kind of angled outsides and round insides, and the bottom one has round outsides and angled insides. So there's also this kind of two-faced or double entendre idea built into these typefaces themselves. And then we started working on the layouts, and this idea of back and forth or mirroring is something that was important to us from the beginning. And so each title page for every essay appears on the back and the front of the leaf that introduces that essay. And on the back, it's printed in a fluorescent spot color, and on the front, it's printed only in black. And we also have, for one type of content, the kind of inscribed Roman capitals, but against a modernist grid behind it. And then we have this other type of intro page with this sort of faux marble pattern, and then the kind of crazy round and square futuristic typeface over that. We're also doing a similar idea with all of the figures in the essays, where they appear on both the back and front of every sheet. So here you're seeing that image in reverse, but on the other side of the sheet, you see it positive and printed in black. And then we have these interviews where that's like a combination of both typefaces and both patterns. And then we started working on the covers and expressing all of these ideas through the covers as well. And letters are kind of crashing down on each other and on the back cover, and patterns are mixing, and we're throwing images in. And after looking at all of this, James Graham, who's the director of publications at Columbia, said, the cover directions have led us to think more on the essay title pages, since those are really guiding the identity of the book right now. And we're feeling a bit tentative now about the stone-cut utopia pairing. As we see those fonts populating around the book, it's starting to feel like they're implying a kind of playful anachronism. Alternate futures of the 60s are riffing on the language of classicism, while that's actually not so central to the book. As one of the editors said when we were chatting earlier, we want to make sure that the book doesn't read as a throwback, but rather a throw forward. And we were really not happy to hear this, because by the time we heard this, we had already laid out most of the book based on a couple of typographic and also graphic ideas that were informing almost everything. But this is one of those moments where you take a little while to process something before reacting to it, and it can be really helpful. So we did that and realized, I think they're right. We'd gotten so caught up in a lot of these design ideas that we fell in love with that we started missing the forest for the trees. So we went back and started thinking, well, is there something else that we can do that's more of a throw forward? And so we decided to use a sans serif typeface on the cover, but we also flipped all of the counters of the letters. So the negative spaces in the R, for instance, are flipped backwards. And this was the final cover, which essentially is similar to this other draft that we sent them, but the letters were a bit jostled here, and we decided to sober them up a little bit. And then on the back of the book, in the same way that we're doing with the title pages and the images, it's almost as if the title is in reverse, and it's kind of almost like punching through the object of the book. It's also debossed on the back and embossed on the front, so there's a kind of tactile, physical sense that that something has made its presence very much known on this cover. So we also did this flipping counter trick to the essay title pages, which again are vastly simplified from what you saw before. Here are the images back and forth, front and back. And I think ultimately we were far happier with where this ended up than we would have been initially if our first ideas had been allowed to just play themselves out. I think because we ended in a place where we have the typography doing something where it's never either backward or forward. It's always kind of one or the other, which I think is a far more satisfying approach to the design of this book than what we had initially. Moving away from books and into an exhibition, Convergence 142 was an exhibition that I designed in China, in Inner Mongolia, in a place called Ordos, where I never got to go. And this was maybe a year or two out of grad school, and I, for a moment there, felt like I was kind of specializing in exhibition designs in places that I am never going to see in person. But in this case, this was an exhibition in which 142 people were invited to submit places in the world that were important to them. And they could be real or fictional, but 142 artists and architects were called to submit text about these places, which is a really, I think, nice curatorial conceit. The problem that we had from a design perspective is that they weren't going to have all of the content by the time the exhibition opened. So what we had to do was build into the design of the exhibition some way to allow them to keep receiving content that could be added as the exhibition was on view. And where we ended up with this is putting a huge title at the entrance to the exhibition and covering the title with these sheets of paper that were probably about 18 by 24. The sheets are pink, fluorescent pink on one side and white on the other. You can kind of see some of that pink color coming through the sheet. And each contributor's name is in the lower left corner of each one of those sheets. So the idea is when the submission comes in, that person's sheet gets taken off of the wall, run through an inkjet printer on the pink side, and then posted on the wall in the exhibition space, organized by longitude lines throughout the space according to where this place is in the world. So as the exhibition is up throughout the run, sheets gradually come off of the title and then start to populate the gallery space in the museum. There are also a couple of objects here and there, but for the most part, this was a text-based exhibition. The title, the person's name also on the white side gets folded over in the corner so that that's also visible when the sheet gets posted on the wall. So this was an instance of something that seemed like this kind of insurmountable obstacle when we first were presented with this opportunity, but that ended up informing the concept for the exhibition in a way that was kind of inextricable from it. We designed a book, I think this maybe a year and a half ago this came out, for an architecture firm called WORKac. And the book is called We'll Get There When We Cross That Bridge. Which, even just thinking again about kind of opportunities presenting themselves, the title of this book actually came from a malapropism that one of the authors made during a meeting, where she kind of transposed one half and the other half of that expression. And we thought, well, that actually makes a lot of sense for this book. Let's just use it wrong as the subtitle. But this is a diagram that Dan Wood and Amal Andraus, who are the principals of WORKac, had sitting around for a while before I got involved in this book. And I think they were probably working on this for probably at least 5 years before they asked me to get involved with it. So they had a lot of specific structural ideas. They also, it's a firm with two principals who, there's often a lot of kind of productive tension, I think, between their approaches. So they had this idea of making rather than a monograph, a duograph. And so the idea of the book being kind of made up of sets of two different things that are distinct from each other was there from the beginning. This is a diagram that shows essentially 10 sets of things. The kind of small rectangles with nothing above or below them are main projects, kind of featured projects. And then right next to them, there's a larger issue that's illustrated through many other projects that's related to that main project. So this is a photo of my notes, essentially, from our first meeting together about this book. And something that you don't really get to see when I show all of these, polished images is that my handwriting is atrocious, and I often can't read it myself. But I think as an artifact of the process, this has always been a really interesting thing to me, because there are notes here that were kind of guiding principles from the beginning that I think remain in the final product. Things like shitty tank top photos versus polished drawings / photos of work. What was that? Okay. Books should have a personality, the personality of the office. Text should not be pretentious. These were all things that were informing not just the writing of the text and the selection of the projects and the editing, but also the design. And so we started by working on kind of two different sets of layouts. One set for these main projects, and then another set for the kind of issues surrounding that project. And at the top here, you can see examples of some issues, and at the bottom are examples of the main projects. And we were trying to get at an idea of things being maybe a little bit messier with this monospace typeface and changing type sizes for the issues, and then the main projects being a little bit cleaner and more buttoned up. This was a photo from one of our first design presentations where things ended up kind of mixed together and scattered all over the table. And then after that first meeting of trying to sort things out, Amal sent this sketch in an email, kind of trying to think through and clarify the difference between the primary sections and the secondary sections. And she said the main projects are 16 pages with big, beautiful images, space, and luxurious layout. There is no text except for an introductory conversation. Text and images are therefore separated. The secondary projects are 16 pages, not of projects per se, but of moments from various projects that embody an idea, an investigation, an atmosphere. There's more freedom in the layout and having text wrap around as you had it. It's more playful and there's more diversity in the range of layouts and scale of images. It's a selection of images that together form some kind of argument, assembled around an issue and a set of questions. Images and texts are woven together. I think the text could at times feel like stitching, like a connecting set of lines. There are also the wink moments, the small doodles, etc., which give this section character. And I think really the importance of that feedback was that Amal was saying the distinction between these two different kinds of spreads and of sections really needs to be more pronounced. And we kind of took that to heart and then also tried to make a book that was as exuberant and unusual as the work of WORKac itself. From the beginning, we didn't want to make a typical architecture monograph. And one of the ways in which we tried to kind of get away from the expected is, again, thinking very carefully about the object of the book. So here we're using 3 different fluorescent spot colors to represent each of the 3 eras of the firm's work that's covered in the book. There's also this sawtooth edge where the longer pages are the issues sections, and then the shorter pages are the main projects. And there's also, the typography. We're using American Typewriter and Antique Olive, which, in some ways were kind of harken back to an earlier era of architecture and architecture publishing. But also we're doing things with them that kind of force them to, deform and take unusual shapes, like not hyphenating and instead just letting the word wrap down the side of the page. We also have these introductory spreads for each of the 3 eras that I mentioned. First is say yes to everything. Second is make no medium-sized plans. Third is stuff the envelope. And then following those openers, there are these brief introductions that talk a little bit about what was happening in the firm at the time and the culture of the place. And all of the images in those sections, which are mostly kind of lousy snapshots, are printed just in the fluorescent ink and black with kind of a halftone screen applied. So we were able to sort of equalize the visual quality of all of these, really all over the place images. But we also wanted to show, kind of some of the personal side of the office, kids learning to crawl, t-shirts, which they make every summer, the occasional cake that's shaped like one of their buildings. And then this is one of those main projects, which uses, these use a lot of full spread, full bleed images. The space is pretty well maximized, but, and those are also printed on matte coated paper. And then these are followed immediately after by the related issue, which is a conversation between Dan and Amal, showing both images of some of their other projects and books, photographs of books that were important to them or important to some of the work that they've done over the years. And the books were both, meant to be a conceptual gesture. That like we like the idea of like these tiny books kind of sitting on the page of our book, but also a way to kind of, I'm not a lawyer, but hopefully maybe skirt any possible image rights issues. We kind of thought, well, if we like take a photo of the book, then maybe no one's going to complain about us using these images. So as far as I know, the publisher hasn't received any legal correspondence. So I think we're good. But also these sections, have the conversation kind of wrapping around and down and through some of the images, and it's a much looser layout than for the main projects that precede them. Here's a more cleaned up version of that diagram that I showed you at the beginning. And again, the basic structure kind of remained as it was, but a lot of things shifted around and many things got clarified about the number of pages and what goes where. And in terms of the number of pages of each of these sections, I thought I would also show our book map for this project, which is, we spend a lot of time making things like this, which I'm not sure if it's just like an expression of my past life as an engineer, or just a kind of reflection of the way that we tend to think. But we often like to mix papers and kind of do different production techniques, and like in this case with these spot colors, we couldn't use the spot colors on every signature of the book. We had to kind of decide where they were going to go. So it was really essential to figure out, well, where does one section end and another section begin, and what are the inks we're using on those sections, and which one is uncoded and which one is coded. So again, this is, I think, in the interest of giving a little bit of behind the scenes of how something ends up kind of coming into being. And the last thing I'm going to show is a website for Keller Easterling, who is a architecture theorist and writer, critic, educator, and architect herself. Keller, when talking with her about her website, it became clear from a pretty early point that her language is critical to what she does. She has this whole lexicon and vocabulary that is really quite unique to her. And we really wanted to try to find a way to put that front and center. So in some of the first sketches that I showed her of the website, there was this idea of the top of the page just being her name and a couple of basic navigation items. But below that, just this list of terms that kind of come from this vocabulary of hers. And then if you click on one of those terms, the list would expand and then show a number of projects that relate to that term. And then you can click on one of those items and then expand more text and read more. But that this whole list is kind of always visible. It's always there above and below the content that you're viewing. And Keller made this comment when I was talking to her about this, that she said that it kind of seemed like she wondered if there was a way to withhold more, if there was a way to not kind of put everything out front right from the beginning. And so then instead of doing this, and also instead of having white on black, we switched to black on white. We decided to kind of hide all of that stuff. We hid all of those other terms. But what happens in the site as it exists is that if you click on one of the kind of main navigation items that is there from the beginning, you'll reveal some content. And then if you click on one of those pieces of content, then you can view it. But also, a couple of terms get added to the navigation, in this case, secret weapon and zone, that are tags that are applied to that piece of content. And as you move through the site and as you reveal more content, more of these tags that are associated with the content you view populate the navigation. And there's no distinction between the kind of permanent main navigation items and the rest of the navigation items, the tags. They're all equally important. And so the navigation actually accumulates and becomes a record of what you've seen on the site. And then there are some sections like events, talks. There's a search bar where if you type a word in it, like pandas, and hit enter, then you'll get some results. In this case, for Keller, pandas is actually an important term. And then there are also some things that happen if, if you leave the site, if you walk away from it after a few minutes of inactivity. We have a webcam that rotates through a selection of different airports. There are some, kind of collections of things that Keller was sort of obsessed with. Images of covers of a magazine called Leaders that's just about mostly old white guys. And then some international standard seals that start to populate the screen. But then if you come back to the site, if you have this in one tab and you leave and come back again a little bit later, as soon as you do anything, press a key, hit your trackpad, move the mouse, all of it disappears. So you might get this sense, you just might only see it for a split second and get this sense that there's something happening, or that something was happening and you just missed it. But again, I think similar to the navigation and the idea of these terms accumulating, there's something in this about kind of flipping expectations or letting things appear that not as a response to user action, but instead they disappear as a result of user action. There's also the error page, which if you go to a page that doesn't exist, this is the only way on the site that you can see all of these tags in terms at once. So again, it was another kind of inversion of the expected that came out of both Keller's work and her practice, but also just from kind of talking to her and allowing her input to inform the direction that this site ended up taking. Thank you.